Okay, this is chapter 8, part 3. So, one of the most important, this is where we stopped, by the way, we were talking about the propaganda model. So now we're starting with media framing. Media framing is a really important idea. It comes up at different points in time during the term. You'll see it in your book. It's probably the most pervasive concept of all of the concepts in the mass communication literature right now. There have been hundreds and hundreds of studies done on media framing, right? A media frame is just a central organizing idea or storyline that provides meaning. What does it mean to frame something? Probably the best definition by Entman in 1993 is as follows: to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item described. So, think about it like this. It's not just what you say, but it's how you say it, right? How are messages presented? How are messages packaged, right? If somebody kills somebody, and I do a news story about that, am I going to present the act of killing as an act of murder or as an act of self-defense? I can present the same facts in two different stories, but frame them in two different ways by the kinds of words I choose to use, by what I choose to emphasize. Look what Entman says: to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient, right? Sometimes you leave certain things out. Sometimes you emphasize things over other things, right? So framing is the thing about framing is it's so important because you can't not frame. Every story has a frame, right? It's not like framing is evil, right? It's just you have to adopt a fair framing, a fair frame. The problem becomes when the news frames things in ways that are not quite fair, right? So let's look at some examples. I'm going to skip ahead for a minute. Think about word choice. Think about word choice for a minute, because this is one of the ways that framing plays itself out. What am I going to call somebody? What am I going to call something? Am I going to call somebody a terrorist or a freedom fighter? Am I going to call somebody a homicide bomber or a suicide bomber? Am I going to call occupied territory or settlements? Am I going to call somebody an illegal immigrant or an undocumented immigrant or an unauthorized immigrant? These are huge decisions, and they dictate the frame, and they will dictate the kinds of evaluations that people who are reading your story or watching your story will make. Remember what the definition, Remember what the definition says by Entman. He says that this will affect how people morally evaluate the story, right? So, and your story, your frame is going to provide meaning to this event. So what word are you going to use? So word choice is really important. So is placement. Where do you place stuff? Are you going to say something right away, or are you going to bury it way, down in the story? Are you going to keep repeating something? Right? We already talked about word choice. Sourcing dictates frames to a significant effect. Here's the quote from Sam Donaldson that I mentioned a little while ago in a different context. The dependence on elite sources can be problematic. But sourcing in general, any source has an opportunity to dictate a frame, right? If I'm covering an act of alleged, right now in the news we have a lot of acts of alleged police brutality, right? And especially a lot of stories have emerged of incidents of alleged police brutality against African Americans, right? And we have these protests, Black Lives Matter protests, right? An entire protest movement. It's a major story. It would be possible for me to write a story that after a particular incident that sort of excuses the actions of a police officer or otherwise sides with an officer, right? By sourcing the officer or sourcing other officers who are sympathetic to the offending officer, right? That would be one way. By using certain words, by using certain words, by placement, by repetition, I could find a way to frame a story, and I'm sure you've seen them, where the officer would look very favorable. I could also find a way to frame a story in a way that suggests that what the officer did was completely wrong and criminal, right? A great exercise for you, a wonderful exercise, if you really want to understand framing, find a story, any story, and look at it in 2 or 3 different news outlets. Now, that was part of that assignment that we did earlier this term, that international news story assignment. But think about something that's even closer to home. Think about one of these incidences of police brutality. Think about some other issue. Right now, as I'm recording this, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday to legalize gay marriage. Think about that issue. Just think about any issue and then follow the coverage in 2 different news sources. What you will find, and it's fascinating, is that in most cases the same facts are mentioned, but different frames because of the kinds of words that are used, because of placement, because of repetition, because of sourcing, these things that we've been talking about. So how is something framed? That's a critically important question. This was part 3 of chapter 8. I'll get this up, and then I'll hopefully get chapter 9 up quickly as well.